We all want our donations to make a difference, but choosing where to give our money, it isn't always an easy task. Not all charities are equal. Just like companies, some are much better at what they do. They save more lives, they work more productively, and serve causes that are often highly neglected by others. If we want to make the maximum impact with our donations, it's important to find these effective charities. That way, we can be sure our money is being used effectively and delivered to the people who need it most. So what can the average person do? There are thousands of different organisations to pick from, each tackling a different problem, each in a different part of the world. To individually research and compare all these charities is almost impossible. And that's why GiveWell's work is so important. For the last 15 years, GiveWell has been helping people around the world make smarter donations. Their approach is backed up by data and evidence. They've been responsible for directing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of funds to their supported charities. So how exactly does GiveWell pick the most effective charities to donate to? G'day folks, welcome back to Giving What We Can, where we explore how to use our resources to do the most good. I'm your host, Luke Freeman. In this episode, we'll be taking a deep dive into the work of GiveWell, a non-profit organisation focused on helping people do as much good as possible with their donations. GiveWell has a unique research approach that prioritises finding a small number of the most effective interventions in global health and development. Joining me will be Neil Buddy Shah, who was GiveWell's managing director at the time of recording. In this interview, I'll ask Buddy about his approach during his time as managing director of GiveWell and some of the charities that GiveWell supports. He'll respond to some of the questions of GiveWell's critics also. The full-length version of this interview is also available as a podcast. So without further ado, here's Buddy. Buddy, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Luke. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so to start off with, it'd be great if you could just tell us a bit about GiveWell, what it is, and maybe a bit of its origin story as well.
Yeah, for sure. GiveWell started with a really simple question, which I think animates a lot of how this audience approaches their lives and their work, which is how do we do as much good as possible? And more specifically, where should I donate in order to achieve as much good as possible? And so two of my colleagues, Ellie Hassenfeld, who's at GiveWell, and Holden Karnofsky, who's now at Open Phil, started asking this question while they were kind of young professionals just out of college, looking to donate extra earnings that they had while they're working at a hedge fund. And I think the thing that they realized pretty early on is that it's surprisingly hard to go online and find good answers to the question of where is my donation going to do the most good possible, and what is it actually going to result in terms of improvements in people's lives compared to what would have happened to those people's lives without my donation. And so that kind of started as the core project of GiveWell, really just two guys trying to figure out where to give their money to do the most good, and has since evolved to what GiveWell is today. At a very basic level, what GiveWell's trying to do is, we have a bunch of researchers and we're searching to find the programs that either save the most lives per dollar spent or improve people's lives the most per dollar spent, and improve their lives in terms of improving their income or consumption. This team of researchers is looking really hard at the existing evidence of programs that have been studied, where there's evidence of how effective they are, and then really trying to model out, if we were to donate additional dollars to those programs, what's the kind of cost effectiveness of the marginal dollar, or what is the next marginal dollar donated to these causes going to actually buy us in terms of improvements in people's lives. And so in practice, what that looks like is a team of researchers that are doing a couple of things. One is scanning the entire academic literature to try to understand what programs have been tried, which of those programs have rigorous evidence of effectiveness, and then which of those are kind of likely to be highly cost effective in terms of having high bang for your dollar. And then there's a separate set of activities, which is around, in addition to the academic literature, having conversations with practitioners in the field to try to understand what are people working on, and what are promising programs that might not yet be in the academic literature. And then I think the third kind of angle that GiveWell's research team takes to try to figure out what are the programs that we could direct funding to that do the most good possible is actually starting in a more bottoms-up way, which is to say, what are the diseases that kill the most people in what places do those exist, and which of those seem like they could be tractable in terms of making progress through more philanthropic dollars. And so there's this kind of multi-layered strategy to try to arrive at what are the few number of programs that are going to do the most good possible with additional dollars. The thing that we're not trying to do is to rate on a kind of shallow basis hundreds and hundreds or thousands of organizations. Instead, what we're trying to do is find the few number of organizations that are kind of the absolute best in terms of improvements in people's lives per dollar spent. And so that leads you to a very different research and search strategy than if your job was to basically say, all right, there's, tens of thousands of nonprofits out in the world, and let's just guide potential donors to make sure that there's, which of the organizations don't have any fraud and have good controls and things like that, which is an important function to play in the ecosystem, but it's definitely not our focus.
Yeah, and can you talk about some of those outcomes that are included in that calculation?
For any given program, let's say on the health side, we're looking at deaths averted. So for instance, there's, hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths due to malaria around the world each year. We invest in programs that provide anti-malarial bed nets in places that otherwise wouldn't have gotten them. And in our calculation of the cost effectiveness of anti-malarial bed nets, there's one part which is, how many deaths would we avert? There's another portion of that calculation, which is even if someone wouldn't have died, they might have gotten malaria, and that would have led to some negative health effects. We try to bake that into the cost effectiveness calculation. And then we also try to bake in kind of income or consumption effects from not having gotten sick. And so we bake all of that into the deaths, morbidity reduction, as well as improvements in consumption or income into our cost effectiveness estimates.
And what about things that are harder to measure or can't even be measured? How does GiveWell think about them?
Yeah, so there's definitely a whole world of potential investment opportunities that are much harder to measure. I think GiveWell's actually, the bulk of our portfolio and the money that we direct do go to programs, again, where there's rigorous evidence of effectiveness and are more measurable. But we try to apply the same logic to programs that are harder to measure. So for instance, there's kind of portion of our portfolio around public health regulation. And where we've directed funding to programs that are trying to drive some policy change or regulatory change that ultimately could save a lot of lives or improve a lot of lives, but are just harder to measure in the way I described through a randomized trial. And so an example of that is our work funding the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. So as a lot of listeners might know, there's a fairly high number of suicides, often by farmers, through the ingestion of pesticides across South Asia. And it turns out that actually a bunch of these pesticides are actually kind of much more likely to kill someone when they're ingested, and they have good complements of other pesticides that farmers can still use for their agricultural work without much of a decrease in productivity. And so if you're able to get governments to ban the pesticides that kind of disproportionately result in death from people ingesting them, then you can potentially have a really cost-effective program, but it looks much different than delivering a health product to a specific person. And so the way that we approach a problem like that is still to try to model out, what is the probability that a grant to a think tank or advocacy organization is going to successfully lead to the government of Nepal banning these pesticides. If the government of Nepal bans these pesticides successfully, how many fewer deaths do we expect to happen because of that? And then, we made such a grant. It did ultimately lead to the government of Nepal banning certain pesticides. And we think that's kind of a big win. And we've modeled that to be roughly as cost effective or slightly better than other direct delivery programs we funded. There's the kind of core product that most people would be aware of that GiveWell has, which is our top charities, which are programs that there's a high degree of confidence in the kind of like expected value of impact that donations are going to generate there. Things like anti-malarial bed nets, vitamin A supplementation, et cetera. So that's kind of part one. Then GiveWell kind of figures out where is there the most need every quarter within that subset of organizations. So a more dynamic optimization of where money is going to do the most good within that set of really vetted organizations and programs. And then there's this huge additional part of GiveWell, and frankly, a lot of our money moved, that is either to what we call new interventions, so programs outside the top charities that we think could meet a similar bar in terms of cost effectiveness, ability to absorb more funding, and being evidence-backed. And in addition to that, funding research for the creation of new fundable programs.
And another related criticism of this approach is that on focus on not even health, but also on economic policies that we've seen over the last few decades, in particular the latter half of the 20th century. A lot of people came out of poverty in part due to economic changes. Is that something that GiveWell has looked at and would consider looking at? And what thoughts do you have on that as an approach compared to the health-based approach that GiveWell is primarily focused on?
Yeah, and Luke, just to clarify, I mean, you're asking about the extent to which GiveWell has looked into potential fundable opportunities to increase economic growth for society as a whole.
Yeah, and especially that maybe compared to cash transfers, which is probably the most similar kind of apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, I mean, again, really important question. I think we've done some shallow investigations to try to understand how promising it would be to make grants within the kind of the broad space of improving the economic growth of low-income country governments. I think the thing that we find very challenging, and that probably anyone else looking at the space find very challenging, is just that there are so many inputs into economic growth. And so thinking about where the marginal philanthropic dollar could really change the growth rate of a country is quite hard, not just because it's going to be very hard to attribute, most likely. And so trying to figure out, how much good is that extra dollar doing, but also because it tends to be the kind of thing where there's a lot of energy. And so in very crowded spaces where there's a lot of money, whether that's private sector capital, government capital, philanthropic capital, there's almost like a prima facie case that you should be a little skeptical that you're going to find really tractable, great opportunities. And so that's not to sound overly pessimistic about philanthropic capital potentially improving economic growth, because if you're able to do that, the upside could be tremendous, especially in countries like Indonesia or Ethiopia or Nigeria that are these huge countries that are growing, and that would affect a lot of people. And certainly that's how India and China have let so many millions of people out of poverty. But I think there's this critical question of just how tractable is it for the additional philanthropic capital to meaningfully move economic growth in a particular country or set of countries.
Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your personal journey to where you are now. What are the significant steps along the way? How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking that, Luke. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, really comfortably. My parents were immigrants from Tanzania and India. And so growing up, we'd go back to see family from East Africa and India basically every summer. And growing up, those were just visits to see cousins. But I think kind of more deeply ingrained in the back of my mind was just the observation that especially in the late 80s and 1990s, India and Kenya and Tanzania were closed economies, very low income. And even though our family was kind of middle class, that meant that there were materially different life opportunities for kind of people that had literally the same genes as me, similar kind of home values. I think something that I periodically do and then am kind of pretty consistently don't live up to the action side of the reflection, but is just to reflect on the kind of two core considerations of, how am I spending my time, and am I spending that time in a way that's going to do as much good as possible? And then secondly, how am I just spending my disposable resources, and am I spending those resources in a way that are going to maximally contribute to joy and well-being in the world. I think I fall pretty short of where I'd want to be, especially on the latter one. But I think the process of asking yourself those two questions with relatively high frequency with a group of people that also care about those questions and will push you on the answers to them and potentially even hold you accountable to making incremental improvements on how you'd ideally like to live on both of those fronts is something that I have personally found very valuable. And so that's maybe what I'd leave listeners with.
What a wonderful point to end on. Thank you so much for your time today. This has been so interesting and inspiring. I really love the work that you do at GiveWell. I think it's been really great to see you settling into this new role as well. So thank you again for your time, and until next time.
Thanks so much, Luca. Really enjoyed the conversation, and of course, all the work that you guys do.